in Southwest. Tell us, you left Emory. You did how many years in the Army?
I was only in 2 years. I was a draftee, and
Okay.
somebody was asking me, you know, what rank I had. And when I was in the service, I'd gone in and had looked at the possibility. I applied for officer candidate school and got accepted. But when you're drafted, you only have 24 months. And then I got accepted for officer candidate school after I'd been in the service after a year. So it meant that I was going to have to spend 3 more years in the service. I didn't want to spend 4 years in the military. I knew that the green color for me was not my color. And so that I decided that then I would just go ahead and serve my duty as an enlisted individual and do my time and get out.
Where did you go from there?
I went back to Atlanta and went back to my family. Was going to look at getting back into school, and the ensuing process of moving back to Atlanta and worked for a while. It was a steel plant right near my community. Worked in this steel plant there for a while, trying to save some money to go back to school, build up a nest egg. Then got involved with my wife, who I married and became my wife. And she was graduating from Emory and had gotten a job at the University of Georgia Medical School, which is located in Augusta. So that we moved to Augusta. When we got to Augusta, I went back, started back to school, and got my undergraduate degree. And basically, because it's related to the medical school, I had an undergraduate degree in physiology. So, and then also took some courses at the medical school while I was there, and got involved with. They had, just at that point in time, there was a physician assistance program that was being started, and I had thought about getting involved in that program because it was being, and it started with Dr. Harm, who was in the School of Pathology there, where I was doing some undergraduate work. I had done
Dr. Harm?
Dr. Harm. I know.
It's a bad name to be a doctor with.
Dr. Harm, yeah, he was a very interesting guy. He was a paraplegic, and so he was in a wheelchair. So there was the dual process of understanding about disabilities. My grandfather on my mother's side was diabetic, and so in the latter part of his years, because of the vascular disease that's associated with diabetes, he had lost both of his legs. And so getting involved with Dr. Harm and seeing him in a wheelchair wasn't unusual, but he was both leading this whole thing about a new healthcare professional, being a physician's assistant, somebody who would go in and assist the physician, not be a nurse, not step into the place of being a nurse, but being an assistant to the physician to help them. And so Medical College of Georgia was the first medical schools in the country to have a program. And at the same time that I was there, I got involved in the School of Endocrinology, which it was one of only 6 schools that had a department school of endocrinology. And so it was kind of for me, when I was there, it was trying to decide what I wanted to do, and I got involved in the School of Endocrinology and actually got accepted. But at that point in time, looking for a job was this incredible. I can remember many people there who were coming out with their PhDs and sending out 200 letters to get a job, find a job, even get an interview. It was very difficult at that point in time to find a place, which made me rethink my priorities about what I wanted to do, whether education, where it was going to lead me. And at that point in time, my wife got offered a job to move here to the DC area. She was a medical librarian, and so we decided I could do my education here just as well as I could do it anywhere else, so we moved to the DC area. And as I said, for a while we lived in Old Town just by happenstance. We were looking for a place and thought that Old Town was sort of this place that had all of this colonial architecture, which you don't have in the South. There is no colonial architecture in the South, and very little federal. So it's just a whole different experience of being there. So part of wanting to live in Old Town was just being in this part of this culture, this community that you had no frame of reference for. And so while we were there, we were involved in I always thought it was interesting trying to get to know the community. And the way that you got to know the community was it was the shops you went to. It wasn't your neighbors, because in Old Town is that you would pull up and your front door is right on the street. So you would park your car, you would get out of your car, you would walk in the front door, and that's the last you would see of your neighbor unless you happen to be out going to your car or walking down the street with your dog. It was the most bizarre kind of community I've ever lived in. I mean, it was just so isolating. It was like, wow, sort of. And then the lady that we rented from, she had gotten a Navy contract, wanted to take our apartment that we lived in the house because her office was on the first floor. And we were looking for a place that we could keep our pets. And so we found a place here in Southwest. And when we came over here and we saw all of the trees, I mean, it's such an urban setting, but at the same time has all this green space. And it was like, gee, I like here. I could live here. This is okay.
Was this Capitol Park where you live now?
Yeah.
Capitol Park 2?
Capitol Park 2. Yeah. And,
same place?
well, we moved in. I've lived in several different units in Capitol Park 2, but Capitol Park. I didn't live in Capitol Park 4. I've always lived in Capitol Park 2. For whatever reason, that's just the way that it sort of worked out.
And eventually you bought a place.
And eventually bought a place. And then after my wife and I, we decided that although we loved each other, we just decided that we couldn't live together. So she lived here in Southwest for a while. I bought out her part of our unit, and so I'm still living in the same unit that we bought several years ago.
So you found a community that had a nice place to walk your dog.
Well, I found a place that was not only nice to walk your dog, but I also found people who I felt were progressive in the same way that I felt that I was progressive. When we got here, the Watergate hearings were still, those were hot topics. Those were hot things that were going on. We're all looking at, because here was, what is happening here is the government lying to us. We all have these issues about whether we're getting the truth. And suddenly, here's where this government is suddenly being laid open to look at the inner workings of how our government works in our process for governing ourselves. And in one hand, it was the affirmation of our process works, and on the other hand, it was really looking at the dirty laundry. And I thought people here, and also when you move into D.C., it's very interesting. People in your community may be involved in very important issues, but on a national level. Whereas if you want to be involved in some issues in your community, those people who are dealing with those same issues on a national level aren't bringing those resources to you on the local level. And that's always a very interesting thing, a dynamic we have in our community that people don't understand. We have some very famous people who have done some wonderful things, but they have been working on a national level, and thank God they have, because they've really made some changes. And I think that's one of the things that anybody wants to do, is to try to, in the medical profession, you talk about doing no harm. I think, in the community, you want to talk about what good can I do, and what can I, how can I make my community better tomorrow.
Since you mentioned it, can you name some names?
Well, I was thinking, I think about Neil Pierce, myself, who is a national syndicated columnist. And if one reads his columns, one knows very much that the spirit of the 60s and 70s is still beating in his heart. There's no, it's about the passion. It's about the passion for everybody. And it's about having smart development. It's about having environmental community that is friendly. It's about having green buildings. It's about having energy efficiency that is smart and that is not all about just big business. And I think that there is a place. Without business, we wouldn't have commerce. Without commerce, we couldn't have the ability to feed or to for food. And I think it's that dynamic that goes on. And a lot of times you're at meetings and where somebody's talking about, I want more rental in my community in here in Southwest. And part of what happens is that there are dynamic forces that go on that dictate a lot of times about what happens. It's hard to buck those changes, but at the same time, right now, everybody is on this kick about having condo conversion. And that's only because at one point in time, developers came in and they found a way to make condo conversion work for them. And condo conversion is really about home ownership in the end. A lot of people may talk about gentrification because we have maybe somebody at one economic level used to live in that unit, and then when they converted over, there's somebody at another level. But still, it's about home ownership, and it's about those people are going to be involved in your community. And it's about getting those people to know who your community is and letting them know that there are other things that go on. Communities have norms, they have processes. And one of the things that has happened here in our community that I'm concerned about is we have a lot of new people. Even in my area, I have a lot of new people, and they don't know my community. They don't know much about Southwest. And a lot of these people, as we talked about before, are going to be people who come here and live in our community for 4 years, 8 years, whatever the political process for the turnover, and they're going to be gone. Very few of these people are going to stay, like myself, and live here for 20 plus years. And you hope that while they're here, that they're going to take something back from them about our community with them, to learn something about what's unique about our community, what's here in our community that we have that's unique to us. And so one of the things I have been talking about is having some programs where we can talk about preservation issues, the history in our community here, getting some things that work in such a way that provides a venue for them to know our community. Because they come in here, and one of the things that is true about all Washingtonians, and most Washingtonians are workaholics. They're more than willing to put in a 12-hour day or an 18-hour day because they know that a lot of the issues they work on are national issues. They're important for them in that aspect. And so they'll be involved in a campaign. They'll be involved in a program development. They'll be involved in other aspects. And what I see is, for me, is getting people to stop long enough to see where they live. I can remember when we were fighting a new development that was in my community here, that what we wanted to happen was we were trying to save green space in our community, and the development was a matter of right development, and we were trying to get the developer to see that he could make the same amount of money, that he could be just as profitable, but if he changed the site plan, changed his design, he could have saved some green space for the community, which was very important for the community because we were losing a segment that everybody had used. Well, in the end, the developer didn't want to do that, and we got involved in the legal battle, and one of the attorneys that was supporting us said to me, he says, Ron, he says, in the end, he says, I'm going to be one of the people that's going to probably be your neighbor. He said, he said, I know these units are going to look terrible, he says, but I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and go to work, and I don't return home till 8 o'clock at night. So I'm never going to realize what was here or what is here. And I think that's very sad.
All right. remind us again, you came to Old Town in what year?
Oh, I think this was probably, I think this was around 80.
1980. And then you
70,
moved
80.
to Southwest in what year?
We only lived there about a year.
Okay.
So, early 80s.
Early 80s. What would you say about how you entered and integrated into this community? How was that? What was your entry into the community like? Did you feel at home? Did you feel welcome? Did you feel...
Well, the interesting aspect, I think, about coming here in Southwest was that all of the residential elements here in our community are not individual, but are, there is like Capitol Park or Townhouse Center or Harbor Square or River Park. So when the urban renewal effort came here, we didn't build back single unit homes. What we built were sort of these developments that encompassed, an enclave for 350 homes or 560 people to live in. And one of the things is to understand about the urban renewal effort, that this happened after World War II, and this was not an uncommon thing to have happen because we just had the war in Europe, had the war in Japan, but particularly the war in Europe had destroyed a number of communities that were larger in mass and area than here in Southwest. So to come here and to think about coming into Southwest and to rebuild this community was not something that was unique or terribly different than what was going on in other places around the world. What the focus was at the time were many parts, I think in part that we hear about urban renewal being focused on health issues, about the outdoor toilets and about the lack of sanitation here in the community. The other part that you'll hear when you start looking at our community and looking at the urban renewal area, it was also about politics. It was also about the fact that here was Dixon Court with a number of shanties, abject poverty, that framed the United States Capitol. And at the end of World War II, you had communism and democracy fighting this battle out on the Eastern Front, all up and down about, was this country going to be democratic? Was this country going to go with the communist bloc? And so part of what was going on here was so that when world leaders came to this country, we could show them that capitalism can work. It can benefit everyone in the community. And so it was part of what happened here. And I think that people who come to our community become myopic and only want to see the displacement of the people. And I don't think, and they may see this as, people talk about it being black removal and other things. I don't see that. That is a product of what happened, but I don't see that as being the primary focus. And at that time, the issue became around people moving back into the community because people who moved out wanted to come back. I don't think that the developers and the people who had the experience of ever rebuilding a community. So I think that was a foreign concept to think about having people move back into a community because I think they thought, well, the people who lived here have actually gone on and we've moved them from a blighted community where we had poverty, we had health issues, we had sanitation problems, and we've moved them into better housing. Why would they want to come back? What would be the forefront? We feel that, and so this concept of people coming in to identify their community with a particular place was really sort of a new thing, and that has really developed over time. Also, this whole process of developing a community. Clotho Woodard Smith, who in Capitol Park, who was the primary architect and person who was very much concerned with building these buildings, it wasn't just for her about building an apartment or building a unit for you to live in. She was also looking at how do I put the parts of the community back together. And she's very well known for her community benefits, particularly like park benches, public spaces for people to come and meet and integrate, depending, independent of whether their economic incomes are like at a high end over here, whether this high end home over here, or whether it was public housing over there. The idea was to have these spaces that the community could come together and be in this space together, share. We in my community, we have no fences. We do not allow fences in Capitol Park, too, because we share the green space among all of us. And so, and part of her plan was to have these shared open spaces and to rebuild that community. And at the time, the English garden concept was what drove that thinking. And so, I think what we've learned is some lessons here that communities aren't just created. There are many different parts of an aspect that go into building a community. And I think we're still in the part of Southwest into building that community. And my part going back to first living here and integrating myself in the community was that there were venues for meeting other people, but there were very few things that were going on in terms of community activities. The focus seemed to be about how to, and still has continued to be a problem today, and that is our commercial component. As I was talking about with these large residential developments, all of that development seems to be built inward, and now we have the commercial component, the retail component, sitting over on M Street and I Street, partnered on 7th Street on one side, 3rd Street on the other side, 6th Street, excuse me, on one side, and it's never really worked. That retail has never worked for this community. I've been involved in many different fights about how to better that retail development. There have been many efforts, many initiatives out of this community to try to come with a plan to make that retail component work. And it hasn't, and it's never taken off. And I don't know, I know some of the problems and barriers that were there has been the owners of the building itself. And when you take the post office and don't allow them to be part of your commercial retail space, you take away a destination. You take away a potential person who may buy something when they're there. That's been one of the problems. I actually think part of the other problem has been the architecture, because when you look at the mall itself, you see the massive exterior of it, but you have no idea of what's going on inside. The entrance is dark, it's not inviting, it's not light enough to, it needed some atrium space to bring in some light to make it feel inviting to be inside. And there have been many, many attempts. But I can remember one of the things that I got involved here, because we've always had crime. Crime is synonymous with any urban living situation. And going to a community meeting and sitting with this lady I didn't know, and I'm sitting there. She said, "Oh, why are you here?" I said, "Oh, so I'm here to talk about crime. We have crime in our community. We have, and of course, most of our crime we had some purse snatchings, which were the major crimes at the time. Some minor break-ins, but most of it was more vandalism, taking of flower pots and things like that. And I can remember this lady looking at me and she says, "Ron," she says, "I live over here in Greenleaf. If you want to know what crime is like, you come live with me for a night." And it was like making me look outside where I live.
Now that you mention it, tell us a little bit about what you've learned about mid-century architecture.
Well, I think getting involved in the issue here in our community about the mid-century architecture is that we, at the turn of the 60s here, with all of the development that went on here, we were very blessed that we had some of the brightest, some of the best architects, not only here in the Washington area, but anywhere across the country. And at this time, you know, my landscaping is done by Dan Urbane-Colley. He's done a number of other projects here up at the National Gallery of Art. He's done Dulles Airport. He is probably he's recently just passed away, but he is thought of as being the father of modern landscape architecture. He is more famous than probably any of the other architects who have been here in our community. He's laid a style that moved away from the formal approach to architecture where you had this straight hedge material and looked at how to clump plants and how to put plants together in such a way to define open space, as well as in bringing in his plant material. He both looked at making sure that there was going to be interesting texture, both from color, both from smell from the blossoms, and making sure that over the period of the plant season, that there would be a continual something happening in that environment that would change it, so that you as an individual, when you're in it, are going to experience something different every time you're out there. And one of the things that I think that the mid-century focus is really all about the man in nature. And that's the whole ploy that man has always had, is how do we get along in nature? There are some parts of man who want to take nature and define it in their own vision. There are other people who look at nature as something to be celebrated and pulled in. And that's one of the things with the mid-century architecture, is its respect for nature and wanting to look at and respect that we both live in harmony, that there's man and that there's nature. And I think that we have a lot of interesting buildings in our community here that you start looking at them and you'll start looking at these oversized glasses, doors that open up, and a lot of times these buildings don't face out on the street, but that's because they're facing on the interior into the nature, the landscaping part of their component, bringing that part into the building for the experience of the person who lives there. So I think that yin and yang of man and nature with the mid-century architecture is one of the things that's been the part that I've enjoyed learning about and getting involved with, because I think for me, it's the part about being outside is very important for me. I was talking about earlier about things that I like to do, and certainly I think that hiking and being out and birding and being in part of the environment around me is an important part. And I think that mid-century, the idea is how do we bring the two together?
The urban renewal project of the 60s down here brought us I.M. Pei when he was a young architect, fresh out of school, very concerned about affordable housing. Does he belong to this school of mid-century American architecture?
Well, I.M. Pei is an interesting, dynamic individual who reinvents himself as he moves forward, and I think there's no doubt that he himself, when he was here, the idea was, and he did some very good work in Southwest, but he has moved himself along in doing these monumental buildings and has been blessed to be able to have a benefactor that's allowed him to build his dreams and to do that. I think when we start talking about affordable housing, I mean, one of the issues that was concerned of here when when all the urban renewal was going on, was to make sure that there was the number of units that were here that were being replaced by others, but also to make sure, in fact, that some of those units were affordable. I think in part we lose our focus. I look at this inclusivity that we're now talking about in our community. And I talk about our community, I'm talking about the district, not just about Southwest, about affordable housing. And affordable housing is more than just, I think we have to have units that can support families. It's not just about having, and what we see with a large part of these developments, they're adult communities that they're building. So when you build a 2-bedroom dominated development, that's not about families. Where are the 3 bedrooms, or where are the 4 bedrooms where people, you know, and we're losing sight of that. We're also losing sight of the fact that in this community, we have some wonderful things to celebrate. We have St. James, we have Tail Court Cooperative. These were all developments that were done about making sure that we had affordable housing for those working people or those low wealth individuals. What I see is, in fact, that we're getting the cart turned around, and we're saying, well, how can we take this massive development that's built for this luxury complex, but yet make part of it affordable for people who are low wealth? And I think we're sort of losing the sight of what the plan should be about. The National Building Museum had this wonderful exhibit on affordable housing. There are ways to build architecturally significant, aesthetic-looking buildings that are, in fact, done within a budget that can be offered at an affordable price. Now, I think it is important at the same time when I mention this that I think we have a diversity of people who live in these units. I don't think having something just designated for low-wealth individuals is the way to go, because I think the other part that we see, that we don't want to have such a mass of people living in one place that they become typecast, or they become identified in such a manner. I've noticed that that a lot of people, the approach is trying to have economic diversity within the community. And that's a very hard thing to do, because what happens now, a developer wants to come along and he doesn't want to build a house. He wants to build 500 of them. And so he wants to build 500 of the same kind of houses. And because once he builds one and he gets the plan, then he can build all the rest. So he's got a large part of his problem. But the idea is that we need to think about how we have mixed incomes within these developments, and how we do it in such a way is that we have no one community or no one economic component overwhelming the other, so that one becomes exclusive or becomes excluded. And I think it is about inclusivity, but we have to really think there's not a simple answer, and to give away variances and building to make affordable housing is a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's the answer.
How would you describe or define this architecture? You know, you've got me interested in this now because you brought it up, and I never really thought about it a whole lot before. I.M. Pei's architecture is all about sort of minimizing the line between interior and exterior, big glass. His exterior designs are commonly catacomb sort of patterns, where a room interior is, I don't know, it's somehow really brought up close to the outside.
Yeah, in the Southwest, I think we had a unique situation happen in that when Clothil Woodard Smith came here and became the lead architect for the first project that happened in our Southwest Urban Renewal area.
Which was?
Capitol Park. And she set out a design element and a style that was then actually replicated by all of the other developments that came after, because it was so well accepted. Particularly the idea was to have what they call a zero floor. And by that, the idea was for all of these, and this is a Corbusier issue too, because part of his architectural styling was to have these columns or pilings, and that the building would be built above. And so the open space underneath, so that you could have that space for those buildings that were around you that wouldn't be dominated by having an office space or something, but it would be open so that when you're down there, like for one of the things, one of the design elements that in Capitol Park was that you could be in front of 800 4th Street, which was the first building, and you could look through the lobby. The lobby was all glass, so you could look through the lobby, you could look across the green space of the park, you could look through Capitol Park 2 because we had an open space under our buildings that allowed a view that would then go across to Capitol Park 4, which was open, which had allowed it to go back to the green space, open space behind 201I. And so the idea was to bring in these views, this greenery, to make it all part of the community. And it also made it possible for if somebody was in the community to see other people in the community. So the idea was to have these sites of view, and I think that with that, of having what we call these zero floor and to have them built up, you could see it replicated in all of the Capitol Park high-rise buildings. You also see, if you go across and you start looking at any of the other high-rise buildings here in Southwest, that style was also adopted. And I think that one of the things also is that you will also see is that there's lots of glass, particularly with the IMP buildings. That's one of the nice things about Marina View Towers, which is a current name for the building on the west side of the property in Town Center, is they have these massive sheets of glass that frame each of the apartment buildings, so that when you open the window, it is just this unbelievable panorama of the view that you get out in front of you. It's quite extensive. Even over at 201I, when you look back over here, or you're at Harbor Square, which is another development that Clofield Whittersmith did in our community here, is that the view, the idea to give the participant who lives in those units a view of their community, to look out and to see the greenery. I think part of what's here that we're faced with now is we are now going to be moving into what I look at, the new phase of Southwest, is the fact that we're going to be having massive development activities happen here. And that how do we keep some of what we like, how do we keep those elements of our current community but allow density to happen? Because one of the things that's pretty clear that has happened, because we haven't been able to forge a commercial component in our retail segment in our community, is that Southwest now has about 12 to 13,000 people living in it. At the after the war, we had about 25,000 people here. And at one time, back in turn of the century, when I say the turn of the century, I'm talking about 1900s, about 1920, we had 35,000 people living here in Southwest. So how do we have more people live in our community but yet share these parks and the screen space? It's a real challenge. It's not a challenge for the not for the developer, because the developer, it's not an issue for them, but it's an issue for us in the community. If these are things that we value, having this open space and these parks, it's going to be very hard for us to challenge them to leave those entities for us. I think one of the things that we're looking at now, with the advent of the development of all of the 45 plus acres that are down on the waterfront, how are we as a community going to feel like that we still have part of the waterfront, which has been part of the important part for Southwest for all of these years, still be part of our community? Are we going to be shut off completely from the waterfront? And at this point in time, the tentative plans look like there's very limited access, and we're going to have these tall buildings that don't look like part of our community, but like part of what they did over in Georgetown with the waterfront. And how do we, as a community, try to make the Anacostia Waterfront Corporation hear our pleas for less density more open space or more access to the waterfront. It's a challenge. And at this point in time, the community has been completely shut out from any of the development. I think it's a startling fact to think about that with all the planned development around us, both in the near southeast and southwest, it's going to be somewhere between $8 and $10 billion, that there is not yet $1, not $1 at this point in time that goes to the community. It's not that we want as a community reap having the environmental landfill site that was over in southeast mediated and removed the ball stadium, but there has been no community dollars that have come here to either the southeast or the southwest community to benefit the community as a whole. And part of a planned unit development activity is that you're giving over building, whether it's air rights or what they call the FAR, which is the floor area ratio. You're allowing them to build on that site, and part of what has to happen is community benefits. And this community is yet to come together to talk about, and that's the only way that we're going to be able to deal with this, is that all of the entities come together, whether it's the ANC, the Southwest Neighborhood Assembly, the Collaborative, and some of our other, we have to come together and decide what's important that we want for our community and what things in our community that we want, that we feel very strongly about to preserve.
You're the chair of the History Task Force?
I am the co-chair.
The co-chair of the History Task Force of the Southwest Neighborhood Assembly. And you got into that undoubtedly in part because of the urging of Margaret Feldman.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about Margaret. She's 90 years old now, I believe, and has moved to Utica. Ithaca,
well,
I'm sorry.
Margaret was, when I ran into Margaret, I mean, I've known Margaret for a number of years, but we became very involved with the land infill that was going on in our community. And one can't but help be impressed with somebody who is putting their community in front of their own, in front as a goal for them to be involved with. It was a passion for Margaret, and I think something that we both, Margaret and I, shared together. Margaret, without a doubt, was somebody who inspired me, and who, through their own, living their own passions, their own goals, one could be very easily influenced to see how that you could be enthralled with and look at as a mentor. Her goal was really about the community. It was about how do we look after all of our people in our community, and how do we do it in a respectful way, so that people, I don't know the answer. I can tell you now, I don't know the answer, but I know that if we work together, we can find answers, and we can find solutions to a lot of the issues that we're confronted with. But without talking and without having some dialogue, you know, we can't do it without that. We have to be able to sit down and talk as a community. And that's why it's why it's important for me that I think all the people in our community are very important to come forward. I'm not thinking, as I said, that I've got the answers. I think I might know what some of the answers are, but that's only something I would be willing to put out and to let other people look at and inspect and comment on. Does this make sense for you? Does this make sense? I mean, this is something I'm thinking that makes sense, but does it work for you? Does it work for your area? Does it work for your community? And that's what I think is important to me, is be able to have that open dialogue and to have that ability to arrive at some consensus. The fearful part is that DC, Southwest, we have a very tough community. This is not an easy community to work in. You stick your head up above the above water, and there's always somebody there to knock you back down. I mean, there's many stories in our community, in the district, and a place in here where people have either been the school board superintendent or fire chief or been in charge of the police that have gone to other communities and had wonderful careers and have done magnificent jobs. We are a very tough community to work in and to get things done in. I don't know why that is. I wish I knew all of the elements for that. But I do know that if we don't work together, we won't get to where we want to be.
Why is history then so important for this community?
Well, history is about people. History, preservation is not just about a building, because people built that, and it's really about people. And I think that when you start looking at preservation, you have to understand that it's about people. It's not brick and mortar. I think a lot of people confuse preservation with just, you know, is that a federal building? Is that a Beaux Arts? You know, gee, who was the architect who did that? But it's really about people. That's the bottom line about history, and particularly about preservation. It's, you know, it's about the fact that people lived here, people married, had families here, they've died, you know, and there is this evolution of people. Our culture is made up of people. Our community is made up of people. And this is where I think what the interesting part about preservation is all about. It's about people in our community. You know, it's our community here. I think that one of my goals, and one of that Margaret and I talked about, was trying to talk to people and get them to see some of the things that we see in our community. And one of the desires that we've had is to be able to put some of the pictures of different parts of our community up in the Southwest Library. And so we're still looking for a way to do that, because I think that's an important, once you get some acknowledgement, because I think if people understand that, gee, this is where the Pearl happened, this is, you know, this is the home of, this was, this Zelkova tree over here is rumored to be done by Admiral Perry when he came back from Japan, and to understand part of what we have here. And I'm just looking for a way to kind of make that happen. I'm hopeful that we've been talking about is having a preservation component, sort of some students being involved over at Jefferson Junior High to get involved in a program, so that having the students there start looking at the component parts in our community and talk about what they see as important, and have them help us see also, because I think what I see may not be what somebody else sees. And I think, but you got to be able to pull back and listen to that other person on the left of you or the right or across in front of you, to have them talk about what's there for them. Over in your community, Vanessa Ruffin, who is desperately involved in that community, very much involved in the fact that there used to be a brick kiln right there in the community, made those bricks that paved those alleys behind your houses over there. And very much looking at, you know, this one came from this kiln, this one came from that, this, you know, and it's very important that you understand where you came from, because if you don't know where you came from, you're not going to know where you're going.
Who are some of the people that you've learned about that you think are some of the pivotal historical figures in Southwest whose legacy needs to be preserved?
Well, I think one of the people that I think we start with is, interesting enough, is Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker is an African-American, self-taught, who worked and is probably one of the people who's most responsible for the implementation of the LaFont Plan for the District of Columbia. We have a overlook up here that's right near LaFont Plaza that the fountain up there, which is looked over by the National Park Service, was done by Dan Colley, who I mentioned earlier. This was dedicated to Benjamin Banneker. I look at that and I love the idea that there's this ability to be up on that space and look all the way down, and you can see the waterfront, look all the way over to Southwest, and look at the whole. You can see virtually almost all of Southwest from that park. My concern about that is if you start looking at what's happening here for the development, is that they're now talking about having that space utilized for a national monument site. And what concerns me is that this site for Benjamin Banneker was the first African American memorial site that was in the district, and they're now talking about tearing it down, talking about moving it, but there's no plans to rebuild it because there is no money available, because this has to be done by private funds. So that they would just dismantle this memorial and put up one there's been now talked about for Adams going up there, and to tear it down, I find to be offensive. I think it's disrespectful. I think it's a lack of understanding about history. I understand that this memorial was only done since the early 60s, but I think it's very important for people to realize that if we don't protect some of the small things in our community and look at them, how are we going to be able to deal with some of the other aspects in our community? And I think this is not just a small thing. I think this is a big thing. We need to stand up and stand for this, and so that we do not lose this memorial. And now I would love to have the memorial be bigger, better, to have it tell the story about how this was a free man, about how he was self-taught, about how he wrote an almanac, about how he talked about a peace process, and many other aspects that people really don't even know about Benjamin Banneker. So, I mean, that would be great if we could do some of that, but I think just to tear it down and not have a clear plan for that memorial, and then to name it after somebody else, I just think that is so offensive. And not many people realize that's happening. Now, the Pearl. The Pearl is another story, rich in African American history. And it's a story about people wanting to be free, and about how they got on the Pearl, the boat, and it almost happened. And it went to court, and it was interesting how it played out, but it's an important part of our history. One of the things that when we get back to talk about the mid-century buildings, and we start looking at that, 804th Street was the first integrated apartment building in the District of Columbia. I know a lot of people, don't realize that. I think they want to sit back and think, oh, that must have happened some time ago. It couldn't be, 1959 when that building was the first integrated apartment building. But it was the first integrated apartment building. The community here was also the site of one of the first integrated civic organizations, Southwest Neighborhood Assembly. So we have a lot of firsts, and we have and people describe Capitol Park with the first integrated public housing as a quite African American memorial. I don't know many people realize the importance of that building, that the building played here in the community, but not only in our community, but the district.
Is there another name that comes to mind?
Well, I think the other people in our community, obviously, for me, and it's when one looks back, one has to understand that the Southwest was going to be the heart of the new Capitol. And so that the initial design was, if you go down and look at the Wheat Row buildings that are part of Harbor Square now. These buildings were going to be the new development because it was looked at when they started laying out the plan here by Washington and LaFont that, that the development was going to be here because of the waterfront at that point in time back in 1790 and was a very important way that people got around. And so the pier here was an extremely important part, and they all thought that the development was going to happen here in Southwest and move up to Capitol Hill, and that this was the part that was laid out. Well, Carrollsburg is one of those people that got into a fight with LaFont. One of the reasons that LaFont got angry and left this country was that there was this fight that George Washington had to settle because LaFont had the street plan. He was wanting to lay it out. Well, Carrollsburg had this plan. He says, I bought this land. I'm going to lay out my streets the way I want it to. So those are some sort of quiet people that make a part in our district community. But some of the other people that have lived here in our community that are very interesting and is Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice, who is the one of the to me one of the stalwarts of our civil rights movement, particularly going through the courts and making the courts work the way and bringing justice to the forefront through the court system. The other, and Thurgood Marshall, his wife still lives in our community here, and so those are just some of the people here, and particularly, I mean, one of the things you also have to realize in part is that at one point in time in Capitol Park, we had over 55 congressmen living in Capitol Park because at that time, the term for the session in Congress was much shorter. So they would come here and they had to have a place to stay. And so we had 55. And of course now we still have some of those people who still live in our community. We had Hubert Humphrey, Gerald Ford. Right now I have Denny Hastrett, who is the Speaker of the House, lives, you know, just one unit over from me, lives in my complex.
David Souter?
And Supreme Court Justice, yes. David Souter is very much, so there has been a very quiet people who have lived here in our community that have been very important to the process for our country.
We have just a few minutes left. Tell us what you think the slogan would be that best describes Southwest.
Well, I think that's pretty hard to phrase, to come up with a quick one. Let me just see. Well, I think for me it's the community that won't die, it won't go away. I think the community has had many opportunities to fold it in, to not become involved in the district, or you know, we've been back. If you want to look at the history, is that when they built the Washington Canal, they did it in such a way that they completely cut off Southwest, and we became known as the little island here. But we as a community have persevered. We've stayed here. I think in some ways we are a treasure for the area, because I think that the residential component, I think if you live here, one of the things that we're very fortunate for is that we have many points of access. Some of our public schools, both Amadon and Jefferson, have been recognized as some of the best public schools in our area. I think also we have been very fortunate in that we've been able to maintain some quality of life components by having grocery stores here, some restaurants and things that have been here. The waterfront, although it's not near the gym that we would like it to be, but it's still part of our community. It's still very much part of what I think about when I live in Southwest. When I go for a walk, I head to the waterfront, and so It's something that I very much cherish that we have here.
What do you think Southwest is going to be like in 25 years?
Well, I think Southwest is going to be radically changed from the community that we have today. I think one of the things that we all must think about is that change is going to happen. Just by saying no does not keep change from happening. I want to work towards trying to find some way that we can say yes and make part of that change become part of what we want to have happen. Developers, when the community becomes involved in a development is only when we start seeing the signs go up or we read something in the paper. But developers, the way they work is that they're thinking 20 to 25 years out in front of us. So that just because you don't see a construction fence out there doesn't mean that they're not plans. And generally speaking, as well, when you see a developer who has a vision and a plan for an area, that may over time, given the economic demands, may change, because as we were talking earlier, condominiums has been a focus. I suspect at some point in time that rental is going to come back as an economic engine to help some of the residential components that will be built here in our community. But my still desire is to make sure that we have a mixed community here. I'm hoping that part of what we have now, we're going to have 25 years from now.